If you grew up in 1960s Birmingham, you witnessed tragedies that shaped working-class life forever. From fathers who never made it home from the foundry, to children whose lungs filled with industrial poison before they were old enough to understand what was killing them. These weren't dramatic one-day disasters that made headlines. They were slow-motion catastrophes that happened to everyone you knew. And nobody called them tragedies because admitting that would have meant admitting life wasn't supposed to be this hard. 1. Your dad's cough. You waited for him at the window every single night. 5:30, listening for that sound that meant he was home safe. That deep, rattling cough echoing down the terrace before you could even see him turning the corner. Metal dust coating his jacket, ground so deep into his hands it never came out, and that cough. You knew what it meant even if nobody said it. His lungs filling with something that wouldn't shift. Something that would kill him 20 years early. Your dad worked with molten metal at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Operated presses with no guards. Breathed asbestos dust every shift while bosses knew it was killing men but said nothing because regulations didn't require disclosure and profits mattered more than your dad making it to 60. What makes this gut-wrenching? It was entirely preventable. British Leyland at Longbridge employed thousands on assembly lines where repetitive strain destroyed men's hands by their 40s. The foundries in small Heath and Aston ran 3 shifts where toxic fumes were just what you worked with. Going deaf from the noise wasn't injury, it was just what happened. The ringing in your dad's ears that never stopped, shouting to be heard over the telly. Normal. When someone got hurt too badly to work, that was it. No compensation, no company support. Men were replaceable, lose one, hire another, and the widow could figure it out herself. You knew men who'd lost fingers to presses. Heard about the bloke 3 doors down crushed by machinery on a Tuesday, funeral Friday replaced Monday. Your mum learning to stretch nothing to feed everyone because your dad's wages just stopped and nobody owed you anything. The Health and Safety at Work Act came in 1974. Bit late for your dad. 2. The air that tasted like metal. Every single kid in your class coughed through winter. 30 children hacking through every lesson, and your teacher didn't look up anymore because that's just what Birmingham sounded like. Your lungs burning when you ran. That tastes like you'd been sucking coins. The doctor telling your mum it was normal for you to have chest infections 3 months of the year because industrial cities made industrial children. Your mum wiped windowsills down every morning, black by dinner time, every day, coal dust settling on everything, curtains washing, the butter if she left it uncovered. November fog so thick you couldn't see across the street. And it wasn't fog really, it was smoke. Every chimney pumping coal smoke, every foundry belching fumes, every home burning coal because how else were you supposed to stay warm? The Clean Air Act passed in 1956. Took nearly 2 decades to enforce because Birmingham couldn't just stop manufacturing. Jobs mattered more than children breathing properly. You ran slower than kids from Edgbaston, tired faster, got winded easier, developed asthma that probably went undiagnosed because inhalers cost money and your mum had 4 kids. Chronic bronchitis, permanent cough, chest infections that wouldn't clear. Normal. The price your body paid so your dad could have a job. Children were dying from this. Respiratory disease death rates among working-class Birmingham children were significantly higher than rural areas. Public health records documented it. But calling it an emergency would have meant stopping the factories, and Birmingham needed those factories more than it needed you to reach adulthood with working lungs. If you grew up breathing that air in the early 60s, the damage is still there. 3. The outside toilet in February. Your nan's back-to-back in Sparkbrook. She never wanted you to see it. 3 rooms for 8 people. You and your cousins sleeping 3 to a bed. The damp running down walls in winter, black mold in the corner where they slept, and your nan scrubbing at it every week knowing it would just come back because single brick walls with no damp proofing meant moisture soaked straight through. The toilet was in the yard, shared with 4 other families. You'd hold it as long as possible on February nights because walking out there in the freezing dark to a privy with spiders wasn't something you did unless you had to. Your mum said sometimes in winter they'd use a bucket inside, and the shame in her voice, decades later, in her own house with an indoor bathroom. Never left. No privacy ever. You heard everything through thin walls. The couple next door fighting. The baby 3 doors down crying all night. Walls that thin couldn't keep secrets. Your mum getting dressed under blankets every morning because there was nowhere private. 8 people knowing everything about each other whether they wanted to or not. The rats came through gaps in foundations. Your nan learned to live with them. The landlord wasn't fixing anything, the council housing waiting list was years long, and you stayed because there was nowhere else. Tuberculosis spread through those courts like wildfire. Children catching it from neighbors, from school, because you can't social distance when you're living on top of each other, sharing everything. Council inspectors knew. They condemned the houses as unfit in the early 60s, but families kept living there because there was nowhere else. What the official records called unfit for human habitation, your nan called home for 40 years. Then she got 8 weeks' notice in 1963. 40 years in that house. 8 weeks to pack up her life. 4. Free school milk and how small you were. Your teacher could tell who was poorest just by looking. You were smaller, thinner, paler. Your uniform didn't fit right because it was your brother's from 3 years ago, and you'd grow into it eventually. Except you didn't. You stayed small because you weren't getting fed enough to grow properly. Malnutrition shows. Always. Your mum did meat on Sundays when your dad's wages stretched. The rest of the week was bread and potatoes and making do. You drank the free school milk because the government knew enough children were malnourished that they had to do something, but not enough to fix the problem causing it. Your teacher watched which kids ate too fast, asked for seconds, pocketed bread rolls to take home. She knew. You came to school hungry more days than not, and she pretended not to notice because what was she supposed to do? Rickets was still appearing in 1960s Birmingham, a Victorian disease that bends children's bones. Doctors in Sparkbrook, Aston, Small Heath saw it regularly through the 60s, documented it in medical journals, but quietly, because acknowledging it publicly would have meant admitting Birmingham's working-class children were being systematically underfed, and nobody wanted to spend the money to fix it. The 1965 study, The Poor and the Poorest, estimated that 14% of Britons, 7.5 million people, lived in poverty. In Birmingham's working-class areas, that percentage was higher, much higher, and you could see it written in children's bodies. Working-class kids shorter than middle-class kids the same age, thinner, sicker, missed more school. The class divide visible in how tall you grew, how healthy you were, how long you'd probably live. Everyone could see it. Nobody called it what it was. 5. The street that disappeared. One day, your street was there. 8 weeks later, it wasn't. You came home from school and there were notices on every door. Compulsory purchase. Slum clearance. 8 weeks to pack up 40 years of living in the same house, 40 years of knowing every family on the row, and the council said 8 weeks was enough time to say goodbye to all of it. They offered your nan a flat on the 8th floor of a tower block in Castle Vale. Modern, indoor bathroom, central heating, real improvements. The lift broke within 6 months and never got properly fixed. Your nan was 72. 8 floors of stairs when you need bread from the shop. 8 floors that might as well have been 800 when your knees don't work. She died 18 months after the move. Your mum said it was loneliness more than the heart condition. Between 1955 and 1985, Birmingham demolished 50,000 homes and displaced 150,000 people, 15% of the city's population. The bulldozers came through like a wave. Sparkbrook, Aston, Small Heath, Ladywood, whole neighbourhoods flattened in months. The back-to-backs were slums, genuinely unfit. Nobody's arguing they should have stayed. But the communities were destroyed faster than the social problems were solved. Your mum's neighbour who'd watched you after school since you were 5 got moved to Chelmsley Wood. The old bloke from 3 doors down got put in Druids Heath. Your nan's best friend ended up in a tower block in Newtown. And they never saw each other again because buses cost money and the distance might as well have been miles when you're 70 and poor. The tower blocks had bathrooms, hot water, heating that worked. But they put families in boxes in the sky and wondered why people got lonely. Nobody knocked on your door anymore. You were on the 8th floor and the lift was broken. Kids couldn't play in the street because there was no street. The old support networks that kept people alive, checking on your elderly neighbour, sharing food when someone struggled, watching each other's kids. All of that died when the streets died. 6. When your dad didn't come home. The knock on the door at 6:30 when he should have been home an hour ago. The foreman standing there with his cap in his hands. Factory accident. Crushed by machinery. Burned. Dead before the ambulance arrived. Sorry for your loss. That was everything changed forever. You knew families where it happened. The widow in black for 2 years taking cleaning jobs at night. Her eldest leaving school at 14 because they needed his wages. Impossible choices. Work full-time and leave young kids alone, or stay home and watch everyone starve on a pension that wouldn't feed a family. No compensation. The company didn't owe the family anything beyond a week's wages. Maybe the lads on his shift took up a collection that covered the funeral. But supporting his widow and kids? That wasn't the company's problem. They'd hire someone new Monday morning. Workplace deaths were nobody's fault legally, just tragic accidents. Men were replaceable, lose one, hire another, and the widow could figure something out. Those kids left school early. Education became a luxury you couldn't afford when you'd lost your breadwinner. The stigma, too. Single mothers, even widows, got looked at differently, as if losing your husband to an industrial accident meant you'd done something wrong. Social safety nets barely existed. Welfare was stigmatized. Widows' pensions covered rent if you were lucky, and families who'd lost their dad learned fast that the city didn't care whether they made it or not. 7. The test when you were 10. You remember exactly how the hall felt that day. Cold, quiet except for pencils scratching and the clock ticking. Every kid from your primary school sitting those 3 papers that would decide the entire rest of your life. And you were 10 years old trying to answer questions about things you'd never heard of because your family didn't own books and your mum had left school at 14. The 11+ exam. Grammar school if you passed. Secondary modern if you failed. And working class kids failed. Not because you were thick, you weren't, but because the test assumed things about your life that weren't true. Anthony Sampson's 1965 book, Anatomy of Britain, documented it. Secondary moderns were overwhelmingly dominated by children of poor parents, while grammar schools were dominated by children of wealthier parents. A 1954 report found children whose fathers worked in unskilled or semi-skilled jobs made up 30% of pupils generally, but only 20% of grammar school pupils. The Robbins Report of 1963 stated that only 2% of pupils from a skilled manual background and 1% from an unskilled background went to university. If your dad worked with his hands, your chances of university were effectively 0. If you failed, and most working-class Birmingham kids did, you went to the secondary modern and that was your future decided. Your teachers assumed you were heading for the factory. Grammar school kids got taught for university. You got taught to know your place. The cane got used more in secondary moderns than grammar schools. Violence reinforcing what the test had already told you. Society saw you as a body for manual labor, not a mind worth developing. If you were bright, despite failing, if you actually had academic ability but lacked the middle-class background the test measured, your potential got wasted. You watched kids whose parents could afford nice houses go off to grammar school, while you learned to accept that 15 was the end of your education. You left school on your 15th birthday, walked straight into an apprenticeship or a shop job. Your childhood over because a test you'd taken when you were 10 had decided you weren't worth investing in. 8. Waking up in the dark. Your paper round started when you were 12. 5 in the morning, pitch black outside, freezing in winter, and you dragged yourself out of bed to deliver newspapers before school because your mum needed the money. Those few shillings made the difference between managing and not managing, and 12-year-olds don't get to say they're too tired. Your family needed the money. That was the end of the discussion. By 14, you were working Saturdays at a factory. Standing at machines legally, child labor was legal if you were 14. Supplementing your dad's income because one wage wasn't enough. Your mates working alongside you, some losing fingertips to presses, getting burned, getting hurt because you were too young to understand the dangers and training was minimal. You gave up your Saturdays. While middle-class kids were playing football or going to youth clubs, you were standing at a machine for 8 hours earning money your mum needed for rent. Childhood sacrifice to family economics. And nobody thought this was strange because working-class children had always worked. 15 was leaving age. You left school on your birthday, sometimes literally walked out at lunchtime, and started full-time work that afternoon. Your education over, your childhood over, the next 50 years, decided before you'd even finished growing. If you wanted to stay in school, if you'd shown you were bright despite everything, your family needed your wages more than your potential. Your mum needed the money. Your siblings needed feeding. The rent was due. Your dreams didn't pay bills. So you went to work, and the system that had tracked you toward factory work since you were 10 finally got what it had been preparing you for all along. 9. What nobody said out loud. You heard it through the walls on weekends. Your dad at the pub drinking wages your mum needed for shopping. The shouting when he came home. Things breaking. Your mum's excuses on Monday about walking into doors or falling downstairs, and you learned early not to ask about the bruises because asking made it real and keeping it quiet kept the family together. Police didn't get involved in domestic matters, as if violence stopped being violence because it happened inside your own house. As if your dad hitting your mum wasn't a crime because they were married. You could hear it happening 3 doors down, and everyone just closed their windows and turned up the telly and pretended they couldn't hear. Your dad came back from the war in 1945 with something broken inside that never got fixed. Nightmares, rage, drinking to cope with whatever he'd seen that he wouldn't talk about. Post-traumatic stress disorder didn't have a name in 1960s Birmingham. There was just men who'd come back wrong, and their families learned to live with it because admitting mental illness meant shame worse than dealing with it quietly. Mental illness was something you hid. Depression was being ungrateful or difficult. Breakdowns meant you were weak. And if it got bad enough that someone couldn't hide it anymore, they got sent away to All Saints Hospital, where people disappeared for years and families whispered about relatives sent away like it was a moral failing instead of an illness. Your mum suffered in silence. Your dad drank in silence. You grew up learning that feelings weren't something you talked about. Trauma wasn't something you processed. And coping meant keeping everything buried as deep as it would go. An entire generation was carrying unprocessed pain from the war, from poverty, from lives that were harder than they should have been. And there was nowhere to put it except the pub, or the prescription, or the violence that stayed behind closed doors. Alcoholism was rampant, but normalized. Men drinking away wages while families went without, because alcohol was cheaper than therapy and more socially acceptable than admitting you couldn't handle life. Suicide happened quietly, talked about in hushed tones, if at all, and the shame attached to mental health struggles meant people suffered alone. The tragedy was invisible, but it was everywhere. Every street had it, every family knew it, and nobody said a word. These 9 tragedies share common themes that defined 1960s working-class Birmingham: profit over people, institutional indifference, and a culture of accepting suffering as inevitable rather than preventable. What's perhaps most tragic is how many were predicted and preventable. From industrial accidents that killed fathers to pollution that poisoned children, warning signs were everywhere. But addressing them would have cost money or caused inconvenience, and Birmingham's economy mattered more than Birmingham's people. Yet from these tragedies came change. The Health and Safety at Work Act finally arrived in 1974. The Clean Air Act slowly reduced pollution. Slum clearances, however flawed, did replace unfit housing. The 11+ was phased out. Sometimes tragedy becomes the price of progress. If you grew up in 1960s Birmingham, you lived through all of this. These weren't tragedies we called tragedies, they were just life. But they shouldn't have been. And remembering what it was really like matters more than pretending it was better than it was.